I didn't ask to.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
she said maybe you can write it down.
Rock and roll. Carabin.
I like the story.
Jet, can you move like? Yeah, that's enough.
I'll just start? Okay. Fantastic. It's the final session, and I want to thank, first of all, Lucas and Uz. Did you get your name right? Uz?
Yeah, Oz.
Yep, Oz, for the fantastic organization of this fantastic workshop. I think this has been the intellectual highlight of my intellectual life. So, thank you so much for this wonderful occasion. I've learned so much. It's been very, very fun for me. I hope it's been fun for you too. And I want
Is this a case of misidentification?
I want to thank all the commentators who traveled here and engaged with my work. It's been tremendously humbling experience for me. So thank you to Matt, to Elvira, to Ilem, to Ishvan, to Jack, to Villa, and to Jed. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for your comments and for engaging with the material. I've learned so much from you. Thank you. Okay, so I've given a kind of quite...
You have to swipe, I'm afraid.
Okay. Quite unusual account of connection between different capacities. The modal force of the dependencies has the modal force of Tübingen necessity, as I've learned. And one kind of question that people have always posed to projects like that is, what is the relation between the personal and subpersonal? And so you get responses coming from two sides. On the one hand, you have people who say, oh, this is all just neuroscience, okay? All we need is just the personal level, constitutive stuff, norms, reasons. The rest, we leave to our departments in the next building, okay? On the other hand, you have people like the Churchlands and so on and so forth who say, oh, you know, scratch the philosophy. We've got to do this from the sciences and scratch all the folk psychology, norms and all of that is just emergent smoke. We got to get our circuits together, efferents copy, you know, box here, box there, neurotransmitters, and then voila, okay? So those are the two sides, two competing pressures. And I want to push a kind of third view. So methodologically, what the kind of view I want to push is what's called empirically informed philosophy of mind. And the thought is that there is space in between these two options. There's space between the kind of charybdis of, you know, spinning in the sphere of the personal, and the skilla of the sharp horns of the merely subpersonal neuronal spikes, as it were. So I think there's a third way in between. And I think if my project is successful, it has demonstrated the possibility of such a project. And I just want to ask what the conditions of possibility here are and remove some obstacles. So that's the general picture. Now, so the project I've pushed is an instance of the kind of thing that we find nowadays. So this is a kind of model from Patrick Haggard, Nature Neuroscience paper. Action is seen as involving various components. It's called the what, whether, when model of action, and you can map this onto networks in the brain. You know exactly how the loop works. You know how information processing is working at different stages. For example, the late weather model involves a late predictive check from the forward model as to whether you get the correct results, and so on and so forth. Now, can we absorb this kind of picture and learn from it when we are doing philosophy? Is that possible? Can we do good philosophy with it? That's part of the question. The choices, as I've said, on the one side is between isolationism, the isolationism of the dark towers of Pittsburgh, and the kind of eliminativism, this kind of hippie eliminativism from San Diego. Okay, these seem to be the two poles. And I think what I want to show is that this is a kind of false dilemma. There is the rest of Middle Earth. Okay, it's not just dark towers and another set of unbearable
Elf
choices.
villages, orcs and elves.
Yeah. Orcs and elves. I'm not. I don't want to identify with that statement. It's got to be cut.
Come on, it should become the new title of the chapter. Orcs and elves.
Between the orcs and elves.
Yeah.
So I think we have to realize that it's common ground between all parties, that all these kinds of creatures that we want to explain and mentality, all this is explained partly by referencing central and peripheral nervous systems and how these are coupled with environmental variables. Okay, this is common ground. So even McDowell believes he has a brain. And he thinks that this is...
I mean, the photo you put there, you know, the Unibomber photo of McDowell, like, it's just so, like, makes us doubt that.
I think who wants to believe that after 5 minutes. So, yeah.
So this is common ground. So where do we go from this common ground, as it were? So I just want to briefly sketch the kind of arguments that has been put forward by proponents that there has to be a kind of schism between the personal and subpersonal. Remove the obstacle there and make some observations about possible ways to move forward. I won't have time to do both arguments, so I'll just do the McDowell one, which is in a very famous paper from Philosophical Quarterly, about 1990 or something like that. It's called The Content of Perceptual Experience. Okay, so the distinction between personal and subpersonal comes from Dennett, actually, in his first book, Consciousness and something, can't remember. It's basically a consciousness and content. Yeah, it's a reworked version of his PhD, which Ryle supervised, and the strictures are very Rylean. So this is how he defines it. We make a distinction between the explanatory level of people and their sensations and activities, and the subpersonal level of brains and events in the nervous system. Okay? This is the original distinction. And here's the passage where he introduces the distinction. He says, this is about pain. When we said that a person's in pain, that she knows which bit of her hurts, and that this is what's made her react in a certain way, we've said all that there is to say within the scope of the personal vocabulary. Okay? And then moving on to the subpersonal, if we look for alternative models for explanation, we must abandon the explanatory level of people and their sensations and activities and turn to the subpersonal level of brains and events in the nervous system. Okay? So we find three claims here. First claim is what I call difference. In moving to a subpersonal level of explanation, we are changing the subject matter. Okay? Changing the subject matter. People and their sensations, brain activation. Okay? Second claim, autonomy. Both the personal and subpersonal levels of explanation are appropriate to their respective subject matters. And if you combine this claim with difference, it follows that the levels of explanation are autonomous. Okay? You have different subject matters. They're both appropriate to their subject matters, and therefore you have a kind of autonomy of two levels of explanation. Final claim is this claim of abandonment. Okay? This is the claim of isolation. These levels of explanation are isolated. Okay? And so those are the original claims setting up personal and subpersonal. And one way of seeing how it works is by looking at some of McDowell's criticisms of Dennett's work on consciousness. Okay, he thinks that Dennett makes illicit level claims of a sort that flouts these strictures and therefore makes a kind of category mistake. The thought is the general form of argument is that any constitutive cross-level capacity claims of this sort will lapse into a type of category mistake. And if that's so, then these different explanatory levels are isolated. Okay? So there's no space for a certain sort of constitutive cross-level claim. So the early Dennett was an isolationist, but the later Dennett is a profligate advocate for cognitive science and cognitive scientism, right, as we all know. And so there's McDowell and Dennett facing off. So Dennett's later picture of visual consciousness is the one that is at issue. Okay. So here's Dennett talking about his visual phenomenology when he's reading. Okay, imagine him with his deep baritone voice. So he says, right now it occurs to me that there are pages in front of me while reading, a presentiment, that's a guess, whose etiology is not known directly by me, but which is, of course, perfectly obvious. It is my visual system that gives me this presentiment, along with a host of others. So this is Dennett's description of the phenomenology of reading. Okay, it's quite interesting because it seems that his description of this phenomenology is that his visual system is talking to him and presenting him with guesses about what's in the environment. Okay, it almost sounds like Dennett has the visual consciousness of a super blindsighter. Okay.
You're getting there. Good first approximation.
Thank you. So one way of bringing out the kind of issue there is by looking at this paper, which Dennett cites very, very approvingly. The original classic paper is called What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. And Michael Arbit then made a comment that rather than saying what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain, one should say, what does the frog's eye tell the frog? Okay? And this is precisely the account, the metaphor that Dennett endorses. Okay, so here's Kermit. And this is what Kermit is interested in. Okay? People may not have seen the arrival of the fly, the arrival of the fly. And this is the bit of froggy machinery, sub-froggy machinery that's most important. This is a frog brain. And so there you have the frog's eye. So the original paper was what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain. So the most important transaction, obviously, for vision is what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain. And then the question is, why should we think of the frog's eye talking to the frog? Because frog's eyes don't talk to the frog. So we really want to translate Arbit's remark into the frog's visual system talking to the frog, because the eye always has to go through the brain in a way. Okay, so the thought is that it's the Dennettian version of froggy consciousness is what the frog's visual system tells the frog. Now, what Dennett claims is, in order to understand Kermit's consciousness, awareness of the fly, what we have to understand are the guesses that the frog visual system is delivering to the frog. Okay, but that seems to get the phenomenology just wrong. Now, the phenomenology of visual perception, froggy, feline, or human, is that of some kind of openness to the world which you then take in some way. Now, this involves the proper functioning of sub-frog, sub-feline, sub-human machinery working well and so on and so forth. But in no way does this machinery talk to you. This machinery talks to each other in a way. Okay? So this is supposed to be characteristic of the type of category mistake that Dennett in alluding to cognitive science in order to explain visual consciousness makes. In summary of this, we can write a jingle in the spirit of Kipling. No, this is not the jingle. No. So, in summary, we can say, to get consciousness in view, we can't leave the personal level. Okay, this is the thought here from McDowell. I won't do the second argument, but I want my Kipling little jingle. Okay, so I think one way to summarize the view of the isolationist is to borrow from Kipling here. Yes, this line, east is east, west is west, never the twain shall meet.
It is a bit.
Yes, exactly. Personal is personal, subpersonal is subpersonal, never the twain shall meet. So this is the idea of the isolationist. Okay, the upshot then is a kind of explanatory isolationism, very bleak. Philosophers and neuroscientists in their respective fence compounds, explanatorily fence compounds, never to meet. Okay? And we might ask, why explanatory isolationism? The thought is that we needed to save the subject matter. I think there is an insight here, even though I want to reject explanatory isolationism. The insight is that when we do the science or the philosophy of mind, we must keep in view the personal level. If you don't keep in view the personal level, much is lost. You have to keep in view that when you're working on this thing, all these mechanisms comes together to produce some kind of mentality that characterizes the whole subject, as it were. If this is lost in some way, then what you're really looking at is just the functioning of machinery of some sort. Okay? So I think there's an insight here that the personal level must be kept in view. But they try to establish something much stronger, that there could be no coherent constitutive cross-level capacity claims. Now I think they don't show that. So some cross-level capacity claims are confused, but I don't think they come even close to showing that all such claims must be confused. Okay. And one way to see that is that the type of argumentative strategies employed don't establish this. So typically what is done is one prominent project is taken, and then some kind of category mistake is identified due to this kind of illicit level crossing. And for the generality that they take themselves to have, further assumptions are needed. So either the views that criticized need to be representative and the mistakes made need to be paradigm mistakes, or they need to show that any cross-level claim will lapse into the category mistake or confusion identified. Okay? I think 2 is going to be extremely difficult without further auxiliary assumptions of the sort that involve things like, for example, McDowell's metaphor borrowed from Sellers of the space of reasons and the space of causes. And in setting up this metaphor, it's already taken that these are exclusive and exhaustive. Okay? And that is driving the isolationism here. Now, without that, it's going to be very hard to generalize. Okay? So if you don't buy into this exclusive and exhaustive characterization of reasons versus causes, then number 2 is not going to be open. So this contrast between reasons and causes it has a very illustrious German history. So it comes from the difference between Erklären and Verstehen, as it were.
No, it's older.
No, you think that's false?
It's much older than that.
Much older than that. Okay, much older than that. Good. Even more illustrious history. Now, without buying into this, you can't make the generalization. So 2 is out. And then it leaves us with 1, whether the views are somehow paradigm views that everyone buys into, such that they've identified some kind of representative mistake. I don't think Dennett's view of consciousness is the orthodox view or represents the paradigm view of cases of empirically informed views of consciousness. So I don't think the mistake made there is one that's representative of the type of mistakes that people make generally. So what this leaves us is needing another strategy to buttress the possibility of isolationism. They need more. So here's another kind of strategy which is very popular. I think it's never been articulated officially in the literature, but it's the kind of thought that you find in all philosophy common rooms, almost, except for the San Diego ones. So,
They gather on the beach.
that's right. So what the thought is usually that you map the distinction between personal and subpersonal roughly onto constitutive and enabling. Okay, so subpersonal can only always be enabling. Now the difficulty is, I think personal, subpersonal, we have some grasp on these terms because they are fundamentally mereological terms initially. There's the whole person, parts of the person. Very simple contrast. There's animal, sub-animal. So in its basic introduction, it's just a mereological kind of distinction. It comes with more, it brings more in its train. Now, but constitutive and enabling, this is a set of contrasts that nobody has ever managed to explicate, but we use it every day. It's one of those things. So typically we understand it through contrasting paradigm cases. So we think of, so one case is that oxygen seems to be an enabling condition for cognition, but it's not constitutive for cognition, for example. So we can understand oxygen here as merely enabling condition. Now, Birch has suggested in his recent book that we should think of constitutive conditions roughly as necessary-ish things which elucidate the nature of that thing, whereas enabling conditions are background conditions. Okay. Now, if we understand it roughly in that way, where constitutive conditions elucidate the nature and enabling conditions are in the background, does that require that personal level phenomena can only be elucidated by personal level phenomena, which is what the isolationist requires? Well, it's unclear because what you need is that constitutive explanations simply require whatever it takes to explain the nature of the explanandum. Right? Nothing about the logic of constitutive enabling has ruled out a recourse to the subpersonal or recourse to something beyond the personal so far. Okay, so that's not going to help. Okay. So I think what we see is that they have some arguments against some cases of mistakes, but this is nothing general at all. So we can't take this kind of distinction between constitutive and enabling conditions to be a kind of distinction that is an in-principle barrier to the possibility of an empirically informed philosophy of mind. And that's because what we have, I think, is a false dilemma. And we see that when we look at these two quotes from Hornsby on the one hand and Dennett. So Hornsby writes, when realism in philosophy of mind is a doctrine about a sui generis personal level, scientific findings cease to threaten it. Okay. On the other hand, you see Dennett writing, there's no relation between pains and neural impulses because pains do not exist. There is no way around this.
Go to hospital.
Okay. So you can see that these are two sides of the same coin. It's because they are believing in this false dilemma that they think it's either science or philosophy of mind, as it were.
Oh, is that from Content and Consciousness?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Okay. I don't want to argue against eliminativism now. So I think it's a false dilemma. And the question is whether there's a way to move forward. Okay. I think the kind of research that I'm trying to do is a way to move forward, which is a way of navigating between a scala of isolationism and the charybdis of eliminativism. Okay? And to sketch a general strategy without discussing specific projects, I think that there are two broad strategies that we can think about. The first is to go back to look at the logic of the situation, so logic of explanation. so philosophers have typically contrasted constitutive versus enabling conditions as mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Now, what if there are conditions which are not merely enabling, not like oxygen in cognition, but something, but don't fall under what's classically constitutive either. So think of something like, I don't know, the vestibular system for a specific function. So vestibular system for the control of gaze or something like that. So it doesn't necessarily suit this idea of elucidating something's nature or something like that. So it wouldn't fall under the classical constitutive conditions picture, but it's also not a merely enabling condition. So maybe there's a lot of space in between. A lot of space in between for explanatory, relevant, and powerful projects. Lots of space for philosophy, right? So that's one type of strategy. Second type of strategy is to show that some constitutive explanations of personal level phenomena can or even must draw on the relevant subpersonal mechanisms. So in a way, if we look back at the attempt that I made to argue that proprioception is a condition on ordinary bodily action, the way that worked was one had to have an understanding of the capacity of proprioception as one which was providing proprioceptive information as well as proprioceptive awareness concurrently, as it were. Without an understanding of the capacity functioning in that way, we could not give the account of ordinary bodily agency that I wanted to give. So that account requires a recognition that there is a subpersonal level that is entering into the constitutive explanation of the nature of ordinary bodily agency. Because if you didn't allude to the subpersonal mechanisms, you couldn't explain the nature of the thing. It's not merely modulatory there. Okay, so I think I want to end there and sum up. So we looked at the distinction between personal and subpersonal. We looked at arguments for explanatory isolationism. I argued that they failed to be general enough to provide the kind of isolationism that McDowell and Hornsby want. And then we could, in light of that, reject this false dilemma between Pittsburgh or San Diego. Okay. And where does this leave us? I think it leaves us with the possibility of doing empirically informed philosophy of mind, which is keeping the personal level in view, but opening space for philosophical elucidation from the subpersonal. In that way, I think we can partake simultaneously in the consolation of philosophy and the pleasures of neuroscience. Thank you.
Just check one. He's terrified. Oh, wait. Oh my God, philosophy.
I think you could collect these sets of slides and get them into a box for the...
Oh yeah, we're going to, I think they're all available on the web, yeah?
Google doesn't let me post all of them on my website, but I can, because one of them is too large.
Okay.
I can...
You can just email?
Yeah, email them to you.
So you cannot.
I'll do some kind of Google Docs anyway.
Your Dropbox?
Use Dropbox, but we can sort it out.
To be bodily concerns, I couldn't have that one as well. I'm starving, I'm thirsty, and I have to go pee? No. So, thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Hong. This was an enjoyable conference. looked at the chapters in the paper beforehand, I didn't have nearly as good of an idea as what's going on as I think I do now, although I've gone through multiple iterations of understanding and then nope, and then understanding. So I'm technically in the psychology department. Like when I say a psychologist, it's clinical. But I did my undergraduate degree in cognitive science. I worked with a philosopher. My advisor was a philosopher. And so I'm not a canonical scientist. But I'm certainly not a philosopher either. Psychologists sometimes call me that when they want to insult me, but I just say thank you. But part of what that means is when I initially looked at this chapter, I'm thinking, okay, I need to go back and read about functionalism and these arguments to think about how to criticize them, and then I'm like, wait a minute, he's not actually buying these arguments as I went through the chapter. He's rejecting them in some sense, and so I don't have sort of direct challenges and comments. But I've learned some vocabulary at this conference, and so I'm going to say is I think I do have a worry. The thing is, my worry is going to be grounded in issues that I don't think are necessarily things that need to be addressed because it's more broader issues. So Lucas might not have told you, but I might be part of this process coalition. I do take an action-based approach to development, and so again, they're not critical comments, but my worries are related to these broader issues, and hopefully it will have some discussion and be of interest. Hopefully, I've decided this is one of my aims. By the end of this, that philosophers are thinking that development might be of more relevance than is typically taken. This is the case for certain phenomena, so theory of mind research, false belief tasks. But I don't think that's because there's a conceptual difference with that domain and any other one. I think that's just historical. Some philosophers happen to have written the BBS articles on the original 1978, Dennett being one of them, telling you what you needed to do the experiment properly. They did the experiment that way, and 40 years later, philosophers and psychologists have a really robust integration, and a lot of that integration is focused on development. But I don't want to argue. I hope it at least motivates the possibility that development actually is a natural neighbor for philosophy. Okay, so right, this was there was two arguments for apartheid, and this was the response to it. And I mean, overall, part of why I also don't have challenges, etc., is because I agree with the conclusions, but I'm going to wonder if the reasons for agreeing are different, and if elucidating those reasons might have interesting consequences. I don't know. All right, so when I read this sort of stuff, part of what I wonder is what is the conceptual motivation for apartheid arguments to begin with? And I think there are both more shallow and more substantive reasons. The more shallow ones are a sort of elitism or a sort of insecurity or something like that. The more substantive ones, though, I think do go to serious issues about, for example, accounting for representational content and in naturalistic terms. And so I actually wonder if, in addition to agreeing that maybe the arguments demonstrating what they demonstrate doesn't generalize, if in fact the arguments themselves are worth challenging, because if you successfully challenge them, does that give you some resources to rethink some other things? And so I would not want to grant to them the conclusions they draw from those arguments. And then the third one is, now this is my worry, I wonder if your approach maintains a sort of apartheid, an implicit apartheid or a functional apartheid, and this would come up when we see the sorts of crosstalk that may be problematic. And so when we talk about, in general, the brain as an information processor, okay, that can be fine. But when we sort of straightforwardly cross over into the mind or the person level, we usually mean information in a different way. We mean in the semantic sense, not the technical covariation sense. And that sort of crosstalk might be problematic in general. Okay, so what is cognitive science? We have lots of young, aspiring students here. You guys are all thinking, Hojam, it's the interdisciplinary study of the mind. Wrong. Cognitive science is a decision, and if you take the wrong pill, you might regret your decision. I use this as an opportunity to highlight part of what I think is extremely wonderful and valuable about Hong's work, and that is taking a truly interdisciplinary approach in the sense of allowing yourself to be constrained by more than just your discipline. So disciplines, for better or for worse, have a lot of motivation from the methodologies, and they have a lot of motivation from what they take to be the important questions. When you do cognitive science, you run into this issue very quickly. Well, whose questions are the important ones? Because these guys don't even know about these guys' questions. And so I think that's both the danger and the excitement of cognitive science, and I think you exemplify that wonderfully. What I've realized, though, is I used to consider myself to be a developmental cognitive science person. Just like I don't like psychologists, I don't like scientists. A developmental cognitive science person, but I realize I think I'm a developmental pragmatist. And this is in part related to issues of embodiment, because the sorts of embodiment that seem to be characterized in cognitive science along the lines of your work are just different than how I think about embodiment. And so I think that's because my tradition isn't coming out of classic cognitive science, it's going to be coming out of pragmatism. Not directly, but indirectly. And so in philosophy, you guys have maybe Mead, something Mead, Baldwin, George Herbert Mead, Baldwin, there's a couple of Peirce, but Dewey, okay. But my lineage is more going to be through a roughly Piagetian sort of pragmatism. Okay, so yeah, and so a lot of what I'm going to do here is just present my reflections on my struggle to figure out what's going on in the article, what do I want to say, and so on. And so I went back to Wikipedia. No, I'm just joking. And I asked the Google, what is the purpose? I actually did. I just want to see what it would say. I asked the Google, what is the purpose of philosophy? I don't remember what it said, but I think the general purpose of philosophy is supposed to understand the nature of things. And I think that has been the purpose going back to antiquity, and I think that's the purpose of it today. Of course, in understanding the nature of things, we don't need to be talking about this world and things related to it. We could be talking about the nature of magical ontology or ontology of the Force or whatever Lord of the Rings is, right? Something in between. But more seriously, I do think this captures not only philosophy, but all of science. And so the purpose of science is to explore the nature of things. What I want to add to it, not add, but point or highlight, is the role that history plays, or origins plays, in understanding ontology. So at an intuitive level, as Turkish people, or just people from someplace, I say Turkish because I find it funny how when I read Western press on what goes on in Turkey today, they don't have a background about Turkey, and so their analysis is just silly at best. And so I think all of us can appreciate how the histories of our own countries, for example, would help us understand the nature of the current geopolitical sorts of issues going on. And so that's an intuitive example, great, but I also think this is actually the way science progresses. Science progresses by looking at the origins. Yes, physics is the science of the nature of physical stuff, and part of that exploration has, especially today, has gone into trying to figure out the origins. What is it like the first 8 milliseconds after the Big Bang and 12 milliseconds? Apparently, that helps them understand the nature of physics. The same is true in biology with respect to its history. That would be more about evolution. We changed radically our understanding of biological phenomena when we had some sort of evolutionary, some sort of origin story for biology, and I want to suggest the same is for the mind. So what is history for the mind? What is origins for the mind? Well, it's development. And you can talk about origins and development in two ways. One is where does stuff come from? And the other one is how does stuff emerge? Now, I've gotten the impression that philosophers don't like the word emerge, but I'm happy to use it. And so, and this sets up a basic contrast in developmental psychology between what I would suggest are nativists and empiricists and pragmatist constructivists. The two also fit differently with contemporary biology in terms of systems approaches, dynamical systems, think about self-organization, and so on and so on. All right, so, all right, this leads us to our next question about the nature of philosophical questions. And no, philosophical questions are not just the questions philosophers ask. Instead, philosophical questions are scientific questions. And I think I've hopefully motivated the point, which is just to come back where I started. Philosophers are scientists, and scientists are scientists. Yes, there's differences between them, but there isn't a fundamental difference between them. And secondly, the reason philosophy has a natural affinity, or could have a natural affinity with developmental psychology, and it does in some places, is precisely because of the sense in which origins and ontology go together. When you have an understanding of the origins of a phenomena, it changes sometimes how you think about the nature of the phenomena. Okay. So, does anybody know the most famous philosopher in developmental psychology? Toder, Dennett,
Socrates.
Goffnick. I think she's a philosopher, really? Somebody's, yeah, Piaget. I'm going to suggest to you that the most famous philosopher in psychology is Piaget. Why would I make that suggestion? Well, because Piaget's approach is called genetic epistemology. He means genetic in the sense of genesis. Epistemology is a philosophy word. And so, first and foremost, Piaget was interested in the origins, the nature, the genesis, development of knowledge. But actually, he was most interested in necessary knowledge, which makes it even more of a philosophical pursuit. He wanted to know how necessary knowledge was possible. And he set out to study children because he thought they were the best example that could be studied of a changing system that might be able to show how you get from something like biology to something like the necessity of necessary knowledge. Okay, so Piaget's stage model is usually taught as a sort of description of children's ability at different ages. Piaget didn't care about children. He wasn't a child psychologist. No, I mean, he says this, or people say it about him, and I think it's correct. But what he was doing with his stage model is trying to begin this project of understanding how necessary knowledge could be a developmental outcome of other forms of knowing. And so the stage model is actually a model of different ways of knowing the world. And the first one is different than the other three in an important respect. The first one is probably many of you are familiar, called sensory motor period, but it's sensory motor knowing is what he's talking about. It's the way the children know the world up until about age 2. And after that, there's a new way of knowing the world. It's qualitatively different. It has new emergent properties. And so on with stage 3 and stage 4. Okay. So this was Piaget's project. And so what that means is, oh, by the way, just a tiny bit of background. Piaget started as more of a biologist than he did as a psychologist or a genetic epistemologist. His background, starting when he was 10 or 11, was studying snails and how they had evolved for certain purposes. I don't know the details. He actually got offered a job to curate a museum, a natural history museum or something, when he was 12 or 13. And then the person realized that he was a kid and said, well, of course we can't hire you. And he says, why not? But he went on to do his PhD in zoology at 18 or something ridiculous, like it is with all these super genius figures. And it was over time that he moved into the direction of what he's known best for, which is psychology. But what that meant is he was always looking for, in his pursuit of an understanding of necessary knowledge, that bridge between biology and psychology. And so from the beginning, he was interested in the gap between, I guess, what's being called the personal and the subpersonal. But he came at it from the other side. He came at it more from the biology than from the philosophy or psychology. And so I just pulled a number of quotes that capture part of his project. Of course, there's a long story to be told about how you get from the logic of action to the logic of rational thought, but he has 80 books and 400 publications, so you're welcome to explore. And so this is where I realized that this sort of pragmatist tradition makes me a different type of developmental cognitive science person than from another way of doing it. And that is because it was interesting to see when you talked about a representational account of embodiment, and I'm thinking, for me, it's exactly the other way around. It's an embodiment account of representation. And I don't know if that has serious consequences or not. for everything I bring up. I don't know that there's serious consequences to them or not. Presumably there is at some level, otherwise they're not substantive differences. But I'm not going to give you that if that's what you're expecting from me by the end of this presentation. And so I've also learned another new vocabulary word. I'm going to call it an inflationary account of action. I don't want to deflate something, I want to inflate it. And that's because, again, we're coming from the bottom up rather than the top down. All right, so the idea is that sensory motor intelligence, sensory motor knowing, which is a 2-year development from 0 to 24 months, is going to be that bridge between the biological and the psychological. Here's another quote focusing on, so these quotes all get at the sort of continuity and the discontinuity. Sensory motor intelligence must be conceived of in a way that is consistent with and extends biological functioning, and it brings into view the later emergence of necessary knowledge. The biological functioning is supposed to be different, at least in the sense that it involves material interaction with the world, and psychological functioning is supposed to be different in that it doesn't. So there's a fundamental continuity while also having discontinuity. Sensory motor action constitutes an intermediary zone between the organic self-regulatory mechanisms and the later logical mathematical operations. Again, the mathematical operations are, a lot of them are formal, the formal stage, at stage 4, that's 16 years of age. So there is a whole bunch of stuff going on in between. But sensory motor stage is the bridge. Okay, compared to biological functioning, psychological functioning leads to the extension of the environment that we can interact with, increasing integration of the past and dissociation of form from content, very useful for flexibility in terms of navigating your environment. And then I think this is the last one. Sensory motor intelligence is that's part of the inflationary part. So sensory motor intelligence has a lot of the properties that people may not want to give to procedural knowledge, sensory motor knowledge, etc. And at minimum, these properties include intentionality, directedness. They're meaningful. I'm happy to say contentful. Okay, so that's enough quotes from Piaget. And Piaget had a very interesting empirical method. He basically did case studies on his children. So he did very detailed studying of his children's development over time, and he sort of interacted with them in little pseudo-experimental type settings. And he drew from his interactions, those observations, his conclusions about making his theory and so on. I have a feeling he might have been a bad father, because he'll be like, Laurent came up to me today and she tugged on my leg, and I thought, if I don't respond, well, she realized she should try something else. And it's like, she wants a hug, man, pick her up. I don't know. But regardless, he was an excellent scientist, though not by today's standards. When I say the disciplines are driven by their methodologies, and I think this applies somewhat to all of them, this is especially the case in psychology. The reason sometimes people want to call me a philosopher is because I'm doing conceptual work. I'm not doing philosophical work, I'm doing conceptual work, but it's not experimental. And so they say, you're not a psychologist. And so by today's standards, Piaget actually wouldn't be considered a very good psychologist. Okay. So that's enough of the sort of developmental. Do you have a question?
So is all the data he uses is always anecdotal?
No, once he got famous and got a huge research institute, they started doing more studies. But the studies are interesting because they're a little bit more like language, where it's either there or not there. So you don't need 30 kids and to statistically find the variability accounted for by these variables and so on. And so the conservation tasks are ones that are relatively well known, where say I have 2 cups of water and I put them down, I say, are these 2 cups the same or different? I fill them up, they're clear, you can see through them. Are they the same or different? You say same, you're 6 years old. And then I say, okay, and I take this water and I pour it into a tall, thin cup. And I say, are they same or different? You say different. And I say, does this one have more, this one have more? How are they different? This one has more. And so you don't need to test more than a couple of kids because they all seem to do it, which is very interesting. So he did engage in more canonical experimental procedures, but I don't know that it's actually comparable to today, to be quite frank. And I'd like to, hopefully this comes up at the end when we talk about, because you talk about explanation. Part of the thing in psychology that can't be lost is the explanations are very clearly purpose relevant. And they're purpose relevant both in terms of the purpose of the researcher and in a statistical sense, and we can get back to it at the end. Okay, so that's the pragmatist tradition I'm coming from, sort of. That's an alternative way to try to, from the bottom up, make a sort of bridge. And now I want to get to more directly the sort of content that you're getting at, where I completely agree. And it seems just at a sort of ordinary level, very, very difficult to want to deny that there's a relevance for understanding the brain, for understanding the mind. And when philosophers dig in their heels, sometimes you have to wonder why. Now, they have arguments that are the reason for it at some level. But I wanted to go to a particular example and to sort of drive home the practical part of this, where it just seems like, sure, that's part of the explanation. Are people here familiar with phoneme development in the first year, where the basic trajectory is up until about 8 to 10 months? Infants can hear all the phonemes of every language in the world. So there's phonemes in Turkish, not in English. I can hear them, I don't produce them. But there's phonemes in other languages that none of us can hear. So for example, if I say ba, ba, anybody hear the difference? Well, you shouldn't have, because I just tried to do the same thing. But if I was from India, it would be different, because there's a ba, and apparently they're different, but we can't hear it. And so children's ability to discriminate, it's important, discriminate phonemes seems to disappear to the language in which they're embedded at around 10 months. Now, the explanation for this resorts to a subpersonal explanation. It talks about something called pruning and plasticity in the brain. The idea is the brain is very plastic, flexible, and it gets molded over the course of development. It gets adapted to what is relevant in the developmental niche. And so to explain why children at around 8 to 10 months lose the ability to hear phonemes in other languages, you would talk about the linguistic input, but you would also talk about brain pruning. And the idea is pruning is a metaphor where you cut bushes, but the idea is the brain undergoes a functionally similar sort of process, such that it has more connections that it needs, and it prunes them to the ones that are appropriate given its situation, and its situation is the linguistic environment. And it seems like talking about it that way and using the neuroscience part of the explanation makes perfectly good sense. So I'm calling it ordinary. I'm not arguing that this is the case. I don't know if I'm using it correctly, but ordinary language arguments, I don't know. So this is an example. But when I said I'm being careful, I was being careful about using the word differentiate, by the way. Because the idea isn't that 10-month-old infants understand the meaning of ba and fa and all the rest of it, whether or not they can differentiate them. And I think that's going to be crucial for how useful our subpersonal explanations are. I think our subpersonal explanations are particularly useful and appropriate and shouldn't be controversial for phenomena that don't get too heavy into meaning. As soon as you get heavy into meaning, I am going to suggest that there are going to be limits on how useful the subpersonal explanations are. There's an approach that tries to, it's a type of neuroscience, but it's a developmental neuroscience called neuroconstructivism. This was Piaget's last student. Her name's Annette Karmeloff-Smith. She just died recently. And she had a research program with a number of other people, a number of connectionists, and so on, looking at atypical development to try to understand it better than how people were currently doing it in psychology. So she analyzed dissociation logic, because that was oftentimes used for nativist claims. The idea is if I can dissociate your ability for theory of mind, but from other general abilities, then I can say theory of mind is independent of those abilities, and theory of mind is innately impaired, a la you're an autistic kid or something like that. This was an old one in the mid-'80s. More recently, these sorts of things have been done with other kids to highlight the innateness of language or highlight the innateness of social cognition or something else. But they're premised on the dissociation logic, which allows you to have the functional independence. And I'm not sure how it is with the neuropsychology, the clinical pathology populations, but I would suspect that some of her cautions about double dissociation logic would actually apply to those settings as well. I'm not going to go into them, but a simple one has to do with whether you're talking about relative or absolute dissociations. Also, determining dissociations, at least in a lot of cases, requires you to compare it to a normal range. But oftentimes that's not appropriate, because if your family is 3 standard deviations above the normal range, but you are average according to the population, you have a deficit. You're not normal. And you can have it the opposite way as well. You can score outside, and it's not actually outside for you and your family, etc., etc. All right, and there's actually a number of specific consequences for how you can double dissociation logic can get incompletely used, I think is the best way to talk about it. She even argues at some points, again, these are all with respect to development and developmental dissociations that people are arguing about, but again, I think some of them translate fairly directly, probably. She talks about in some cases, disorders might suggest association rather than dissociation. And she made a lot of progress on Williams syndrome and other atypical developmental disorders in providing explanations. We didn't think these kids with Williams syndrome had a face recognition problem. They do. They just compensate very early in development for it. And what we didn't realize, because we didn't know that, is that that face recognition problem seems to be related to their number problem. It's not an isolated domain separate from language showing a dissociation. In fact, there's a similar underlying cause of both the number deficit and the atypical face processing. And you're never going to discover those things unless you're looking at the developmental trajectories of these kids. Okay, so how are we doing on time? I don't need to talk so long.
10 minutes more, is that okay?
Yeah, I can wrap up in 5 minutes. My mouth is getting dry.
Yes.
So, okay, great. So I've shared lots of stuff with you guys, but let's get back a little bit closer to the chapter. One thing that has come up for me a lot throughout the conference, though, is what exactly personal and subpersonal mean. So when I first saw the title, I actually thought it was going to be tacit knowledge versus person level knowledge, because in theory of mind and the stuff I read, that's usually how people talk about it. And it doesn't matter, of course. Fine, we'll come up with a new term for that and this. But what I think, I don't know if it matters, but what I'm curious about is having this single distinction, because it seems like there are very important differences between types of personal stuff, especially if you're going to be accepting anything like Piaget's stages of knowing. The concrete stage, which is right after sensory motor, has really important differences for how you know the world than the sensory motor stage does. And you can talk in ways that might suggest the concrete stage, but are at the sensory motor stage. What do I mean? I think it actually came up, possibly, for the comment you asked about in terms of, it's been too long. You asked about the wording of things, whether you switched it around. The awareness of such and such, or
awareness of the body, or bodily awareness.
Yes.
That was the last one.
And I think yes, and so you can say it doesn't have a distinction, but if you take this forms of knowing perspective and you have sensory motor knowing would be capturing bodily awareness,
But not awareness.
and it would be something qualitatively different to talk about awareness of the body. And again, this is where I say I don't know that there's an implication or anything like that. But what I am curious about is the sort of the lack, because philosophers love distinctions, the lack of qualitative distinctions within each of these levels. And so for the personal, I think there's important distinctions between whatever we mean by consciousness versus reflective consciousness. In general, I think 2-year-olds up to 2 years, babies are conscious, dogs are conscious, cats are conscious. Adults have the possibility of being reflectively conscious as well as the first type of consciousness. I'm not sure how other people would be happy with those sorts of distinctions or not. But then going back to the biology as well, of course, neuroscience isn't biology. It might be a subset of biology, but it has importantly different qualities from other sorts of biological phenomena. And then even within neuroscience, studying neurons and studying systems is a very different sort of project. And I think there's this, I don't know, I wouldn't want to argue it because I have never thought it through, but I think there's the same sort of qualitative differences for the subpersonal side of things as well. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning, what is the motivation? There's the less substantive, more substantive. I think part of the motivation is this fact norm history within psychology. For however long, this sort of division has been there, and the normative is the province of philosophy, and the factual is the province of psychology and neuroscience, right? And so this is where when I say directly challenging those arguments may lead us forward, and I think it's in terms of this. I would like to think that all biological phenomena are normative, and there's different types of normativity. And I'd like to think this because I come at things a little bit from the bottom up and a little less from the top down. I feel like when you come from the top down, you want to drag the factual into the normative realm. No, I can't think this through straight right now. I'm going to stop. Okay, and we can talk more about this stuff. Systems that are far from thermodynamic equilibrium and normative emergence and so on. One of the things that I think is going on for what I take to be some of the differences in the sort of developmental pragmatism that I take versus cognitive science embodiment is going to have to do with issues that, again, these aren't criticisms because they're not something you can deal with. These are outside the realm of the project. And they have to do with folk psychology as a scientific ontology. I think, so going through my education, I became an eliminative materialist after reading Churchill, and it's like, yeah, this isn't good. But of course, that's not the conclusion. It shouldn't be to reduce the mind to the brain. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the initial rejection isn't correct. It could be the case, and again, coming from the bottom up, it makes it easy to be the case that folk psychology is not the ontology of the mind at all. And this comes up a lot in studying social cognition research, and Matthew Ratcliffe made the point a long time ago for that literature. There's a difference between folk psychology as scientific ontology and folk psychological discourse, and usually we use folk psychological discourse to motivate how this is part of the ontology of the mind. So this is classic for social cognition research. There's also the functionalism and the computationalism. In some sense, functionalism, I assume almost everyone agrees, has to be correct. But whether the computational versions of it have to be correct or not, I would suggest not. I don't know. I don't have anything substantive to say on these things. But I do think that the computationalism contributes to the conflations that go on between the two different senses of information, between brain talk and mind talk. And it can go on either in talking about information in both cases, or it can go on in terms of talking about representation, brain representing stuff, etc. Okay, so I come back to where we started. I want to ask a question. I assumed the reason they focused on perception and then action, I'm not quite so sure. Because we do this in psychology sometimes. We say if something applies even at the level of psychology, say cultural influences, so we say cultural influences apply even at the level of perception, then surely cultural influences apply at the level of cognition. I don't know if that's a similar sort of reason why they think they're entitled to generalize to it all. I agree that they're not, but I'm wondering if that's an additional aspect of why they think they are. Okay, so I've already kind of done this. So if I were to engage in the project of trying to criticize directly, I'm quite confident that my criticism or my challenge to the first argument would come down to, I would take both of them as reductios. And what I take them as reductios, or they would be reductios in the sense that for the first one, the reason they're reaching their absurd conclusion, which is that there is no subpersonal personal communication, is a consequence of not having a naturalized account of content. For the second one, again, I don't have the arguments, I'm not going to do the arguments, but I'm confident, I will say I'm confident to say this is the direction that I think I would want to argue in if this were my project. For action and causation, I want to say it's a poverty of the action argument. When I say I want an inflationary account of action, it's because I'm willing to pump way more stuff into action than it seems like philosophers of action are willing to accept. I'm really not familiar with the action and causation literature at all. The issues of naturalized content I am familiar with because I've had to read lots of Fodor and other things. Everybody knows Fodor passed away 2 days ago. Yeah. Okay, so let me wrap up. So, okay, trying to get a little bit more specific about maybe the ways in which development is relevant to philosophy. I'm trying to apply it to the particulars of this situation, and I don't have, strong feelings one way or the other on it. They're just the things that came up over the course of the talks. And so I wonder if pathological dissociations are useful, however careful you have to be about making them. Are developmental dissociations useful? And I brought up in the one context. And are they a source of constraint that would be useful for understanding? See, this, I also thought in the beginning that you were going for issues of necessity. I thought, of course they are, because if you show a kid who can't do it the way that it's supposed to need to be done, then you have a counterexample. A nice one of these, I think, is, so we were in philosophy of science class, and the teachers or psychology teachers talking about systematicity, Fodor. And if you have this thought, X relates to Y, you have to be able to have the thought Y relates to X. I put my hand and I said, does that mean if I have a brother, I have to be able to know that my brother has a brother? And he says, yes. And I said, but kids don't do that. When they're 6 years old, you can say, do you have a brother? And they shake their head. And, did your brother have a brother? And they shake their head. Anyway, so that's what I have in mind when I say, could developmental dissociations be relevant? I don't know. Because you get lots of them. You get them across development, but you get them within we'll call it a developmental stage, or within a task, for example. So dissociations is the norm. And this is because, of course, development, part of what's going on is creating that unity that we have in adults that then gets impaired in these weird pathologies and so on. All right. And so, well, I'm asking if this could be a source of constraint that would be useful. I also think in some cases it's actually useful for an explanation. So the case of the deafferent gentleman who could walk through compensating in some way. And the question came up, I think Lucas brought up a couple of times, that it seemed like an important counterexample. But it seems to me that there's an important distinction to be made between the conditions for something to develop, meaning the ability to walk, and the conditions for it to be executed. And they almost certainly are not the same. And my example isn't the afferent man, my example is shame. The developmental conditions for shame are inherently social. If there is no socialness, you will not develop the feeling of shame. The self-conscious emotions happens around age 2, so on and so on. But of course, my Turkish friends all know that you can feel shame when you're by yourself without any people evaluating you negatively. So shame is supposed to be a negative evaluation of the self in some sense. And so that's my example of a phenomena that has different conditions for its development than it does for its execution. And in the case of deafferent man, I think, why is proprioception so crucial? Well, it might be so crucial for the development of the ability to walk. Thank you.
Very nice, thank you, Joe. It's very nice to have a psychologist sort of wrap up with words of wisdom and sort of reflect on the state of the profession. I think it's good. I think one thing that's always important in doing philosophy is thinking about the point and the value of doing philosophy. And if you're a more philosophically inclined scientist, it's always important to sort of step back and think about the roots and so on. So I'm all for that. And I think to put your remarks in the most unfriendly way possible,
Sure.
so that we can note them for
Whatever challenging value they have.
I think is that a lot of you could say that a lot of the angst that I went through in articulating my project could have been eased simply by looking at development and thinking about how what the ontogenetic conditions on the capacity I'm interested in are, such that in establishing these ontogenetic conditions in that very way, then then we realize that there are certain conditions on the acquisition of this capacity, such that it's shaped in this way. That's very nice. I think I completely agree that that should be a much richer source for philosophical reflection. And in that vein, I'm going to plug my friend's book. So Stephen Butterfield has a book, I think it's called The Philosophical Significance of Development, which is supposed to be coming out with Routledge soon. He's one of McNutt's colleagues at Warwick, and he's, I think, the philosopher who has taken development most seriously as a test case for a huge range of things, thinking about mind reading, categorical perception, joint action, coordination, and a range of things. And I think much more of that could be done. But looking back at my angst, one way I could have cut the argument short would have been to argue for subpersonal conditions as subpersonal aspects as constitutive for certain, at least partially constitutive for personal level capacities, just by going through two sets of arguments, looking at pathological cases to establish that certain mechanisms are crucial for the functioning, and looking at developmental cases to establish that the particular trajectory of development implicates certain capacities as being, certain mechanisms as being crucial for the final adult capacity. So I could have done that. And then here I will give my disciplinary excuse, which may not be an exculpation. Which is that the standards in the discipline currently are such that you need to establish it for the adult human normal case. But I think we could be more liberal, and so there are two ways to take what I could be doing. I could extend this so that I look at the pathological cases, I look at development, and I also try to argue in the adult human case so that we have a much larger kind of range of cases, and the case is much stronger. But I also feel a certain kind of, so this is sort of conceding. I also feel a certain pull for the other side, that there is something to the distinction between distinguishing between constitutive and enabling conditions, and that has been valuable for various projects. So we don't want to just kind of push that away or make it into a mush of some sort. Because clearly in some cases we have things which are modulatory, which are causal conditions, which are not yet such that they are fully explanatory. And so, for example, as you say, there's a difference between conditions on development and conditions on execution. So often, and you're right to point out that the nature of a thing has to be understood both by virtue of current conditions on execution and conditions on its development. But often in cases, once you fix the conditions on development, then there's a question, what are the conditions on execution? And that's often what people are most excited about. But I think there's
and don't get me wrong, I don't think you the thing with this is going to be a case-by-case sort of situation, and sometimes it might be useful and sometimes it might not. But the caveat I'm going to give is it depends. I will put a little bit stronger than it definitely doesn't matter for learning, because sometimes with a lot of various paradigms, I wonder how much people are taking into consideration the relevance of the learning that's going on in that little.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
But no, I think you don't have to understand the development. It's a source of constraint.
Yes.
And for some projects, it could be informative and useful more than for other projects. I'm fine with that.
Fully agree. And I endorse the call to arms that we should do more development.
Well, it just kind of occurred to me. Like I always thought philosophers were very much using developmental constraints because they do in social cognition. But I've gone back out into the broader world of philosophy, and I realized no, they don't at all.
It's the opposite. Yeah. It's the developmentalists who are using a lot of philosophy, actually. So you look at Gopnik or Chibra or people like that, they're really using a lot of philosophy in order to drive the studies. So we should also pay back the compliment. So
yeah, we've just been reading in our reading group this semester Susan Carey. She's another one of these
extremely sophisticated developmental.
Married to
a philosopher.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree on many of those cases. I think fundamentally the motivation for our apartheid comes from the distinction between Eclairon and Verstehen and these two modes of understanding. And if you look at 19th century philosophical anthropology and this idea of Verstehen that you have to understand the other from the inside through sort of emoting and simulating. Then, whereas the other one was looking at the moving parts, the mechanisms, and so on and so forth. What that became imbued with was, for example, you find in German idealism the idea of different kinds of structures being involved. On the one hand, you have normative structures, and on the other hand, you have the mechanical structures of Newtonian philosophy. So you find this contrast in Kant very clearly. Now, once you work it up to those heights, then it becomes a chasm that cannot be passed. And I think what McDowell and company are doing in Pittsburgh is basically celebrating this chasm. But if we go back to the original distinction, we can see that we can make sense of a lot of this whilst not seeing it as a sharp chasm.
Because I think that's the problem. That you've got machines and minds, and I think your whole point is that just misses out animals. Yeah. So once you move to biology, I think. Yeah. Sorry, this was because the way they are setting it up is like you've either got these machines and you've got these minds, and I think your suggestion I'm very on board with. That, you've got
with a lot of
life.
in between stuff.
You've got living beings, and they're not machines, and they're not mechanisms.
Mm.
Right.
And so once you've got living beings,
Yeah.
you haven't got this machine-mind dichotomy.
Yeah.
And you've already got some
Because the brain's
normativity.
not a machine.
Yeah. And then you've already got some sort of normativity. Yeah.
But it can get very complicated even if you allow for animals, because you can see that project that you just described instantiated in the work of Susan Hurley, for example. So she was one of McDowell's pupils, and she tried to push down the McDowellian project through looking at animals and seeing norms, islands of
This is sort of
rationality.
pushing things up. I think this is the way to go.
Yeah.
A small miscellany, if I might. On your slide 27, you had the two strategies. One of which, I'm trying to remember quite how you phrased it, that it was about
The constitutive enabling.
yes,
They don't
exactly
need to be
that. It was
exclusive, the
about
first strategy.
examining constitutive conditions as constrained by certain kinds of enabling conditions. Thank you. That's Kant's strategy. That's Kant's strategy in the Critique of Pure Reason.
Of
Examining what kinds of cognitive functions we must effectively and validly instantiate such that we can integrate information over time and through space sufficiently that we can identify anything in our surroundings such that we can distinguish ourselves from it.
But how is that exactly corresponding to my strategy?
Part of what he's paying attention to
Uh-huh.
are constraints on synthesizing information over
Right.
time and through space.
But I thought everything for Kant is at the personal level.
That's false.
Okay.
That's just false. And I've sent you the shortest paper that can get it somewhere.
Okay.
But the other thing is to look at Andrew Brooks' piece on Kant and the mind in the current SEP, right? The Stanford Encyclopedia. He's done a lot with Kant and cognitive sciences. Very good. But no, Kant is chock full of subpersonal information processing without which we could never identify anything.
In the first critique.
Yes, most of the critique is that.
Okay.
And what's brilliant is that for as much as he talks about processes, the processes help specify which questions of validity have to be posed and answered. So he's very clear about the difference between which issues are process and which issues are normative issues about validity, justified or justifiable knowledge. It's fabulous how he does it. And partly because he's got a profoundly functionalist cognitive architecture there. And when you mention the, alleged distinction between what's factual and what's normative, right? I mean, this is exactly where the Aristotelianism makes sense, right? Proper functioning is a normative notion. Hence, simply functioning is a normative notion, in contrast to failure to function or dysfunction. And so the presumption, and I know how widespread it is, that we can separate off what's normative and what's factual is just hopeless. It's absolutely hopeless. And so, I mean, believe me, I'm all behind the kind of project that you're working on here, and I'm delighted to see it. But I want to say that it's been a long time coming back. At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, there was enormous multidisciplinary research in philosophy, psychology, neurophysiology, ethology, and it was absolutely cosmopolitan. But it was not done terribly well, most of it. It really wasn't. They didn't have the research methods, much less could they figure out how to integrate these different kinds of disciplines. But remember that the journal Mind originally had the subtitle, right, A Quarterly of Philosophy and Psychology. And that subtitle didn't disappear until Ryle's editorship in the 60s. It had long since gone out of use. But that opening decade of Mind is a fabulous sort of profile of what philosophy and this multidisciplinary and also cosmopolitan kind of research was like. It includes, for example, a biography of an infant by Charles Darwin. Oh yes. And
There you go.
detailed reports on the latest in neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, and again, internationally.
Excellent.
I was labeling, but so I couldn't help but notice that how was similar to what you said. I don't know whether you read Armstrong's The Causal Theory of Mind paper. Well, the beginning of this paper is exactly the kind of spiel that you gave about that actually philosophers are answering the, as he calls it, first order questions. Like we're not doing something different than, and it's basically the same idea, we are studying the things. Exactly, almost. It was
Great.
I thought maybe you read it because it was so similar.
No,
So,
I didn't know where to start.
so
I took notes. I did one thing, and now I sat down with a PowerPoint. I'm like, I don't know where to start.
You want to check it out. And he's
Thank you.
comparing to basically, his opponent is logical positivists. Look, the way logical positivist does philosophy, so it's not the same context, but
Right.
what he proposes is very similar to what you were saying. Anyway, so it's just a small note, but not. Sometimes the way you attribute enabling claims to some people is not, these people, when they use the word enabling, they are not also using, I think in a sense, that this to be constructed with the constitutivist claims. So you actually said something about Moran using enabling.
Moran?
Yeah, in
No.
chapter 1. Yeah, about the knowledge of actions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that use of enabling, I think, given the context, is not used by Moran as a way in which actually will be to be constructed with
I disagree, because he's directly quoting Falvey, and Falvey is exactly contrasting those two things.
But it's not about the action, what's constitutive of action, it's about the knowledge of it. So
yeah,
there's
it's
different layers.
constitutive of knowledge of action, not of action, but knowledge of action.
But anyway, I disagree on that. So
Yeah, so I'm just wondering,
So the way things you set you up, at one level you might think, how could there possibly be a problem here? So if you think the personal and subpersonal is just part whole, then explaining a feature of a whole in terms of one of its parts, that doesn't seem problematic in itself. And it seems to me like, you ask me, like, okay, why can't you see? Oh, Hong Yu tore my eyes out. Yeah, and they're kind of, you start off, you've got something at the personal level I can't see, that seems clearly personal, and then there's something wrong with one of the parts, and that's why I can't see, and that seems absolutely unproblematic. Or like, I can't pick up the cup because Hong Yu chopped my hands off, or I can't walk because Hong Yu kind of cut my tendons. And it seems like those sort of explanations are perfectly fine.
Can we split your tongue?
But in general, kind of, you've got something going on at the personal level, and then there's some part of your body. I mean, why on earth could anyone have a problem with that? So that, it seems to me like it can't be just that there's a problem with just giving an explanation where you've got something personal and then you appeal to something that is a part of the whole.
Yes, good. So the problem isn't about a neurological explanation.
Yeah, and it's not, and I don't think it's really about explanations. I think the problem is explaining, well, the phenomenal in subpersonal terms, or the personal in subpersonal terms, and the subpersonal in personal terms. I think that's the sort of real problem, is if you're sometimes importing the personal into the subpersonal or vice versa. And the guys you looked at had the problem of explaining the personal in subpersonal terms. I guess you've got the other thing. You've got the Dennett-Hacker debate, which is going the other way, which is the problem of explaining the subpersonal in personal terms. So you might think kind of the argument is, do I believe? And then Dennett wants to say, well, this bit of your brain believes. And then you're kind of, in some sense, applying a personal level predicate to a part, and I think this is where there's supposed to be a category mistake. And I think maybe there is something right to that. So I think you can keep a sort of subpersonal, personal apartheid, but not in terms of explanation, but maybe in terms of predication. And I think it's worthwhile just being careful about using the vocabulary that's appropriate to the level of description you're going. And so I actually think that the division and that sort of warning is really useful. But because you've got one sentence that's in good personal level vocabulary, one in subpersonal level, that I don't think why that then should be a problem. If we can say, well, I can't see because I haven't got an eye, why, so I'm just wondering, and so you're happy with this, we've got to be careful about using the approach, that seems perfectly right. And I think this is something like the representation talk, the information talk. I think there's a lot of problem with the word information being used in very different ways at the subpersonal and personal level, and then what you get is miscommunication because you've got this one word. And I think it's quite important to keep this sort of divide. But I'm wondering why the explanatory divide, because it does, even if you buy into the sort of normative stuff, I don't think what's motivating why you can't say, just like if you think they're saying Mariological, is that okay?
Yeah, it makes sense.
I
think I agree.
Okay.
So I think we want to distinguish. So as your remarks about tearing out bits of people and naming them.
Yeah, that was you.
You were who did it. I just reported it.
Well, what that shows that it's not merely a neurological thing. That's going on, but something more specific. And then the further question is why you should block certain kinds of because claims. Some of them involve the types of errors that we agreed that a warning is apt to sort of ward us off these cases. So that's good. And I think the spirit of my remarks is that there's a lot of open space in between, and it depends on what kinds of explanations we can get afloat. So I think I agree. Now the question is where you're coming from. So in the last, 15 years of giving talks on philosophy seminar rooms, I've been getting flack from a different direction. So if you're coming from a much more open direction, you know, so you think of now, for example, if your daughter asks you, how could it have been possible, like 100 years ago, that women couldn't go to college and vote? I mean, if you're coming from a different point of view where things are just obviously the case, then you fail to see why it's a problem. I mean, so there's a question. So one question I often get asked is, why is any of this important? So people will say, okay, all you have to say is that if you lose proprioception, you're in trouble. That's it. That's all you can say as a philosopher. Nothing more. And I think there's a much richer story which you can tell, which explains the character, the unique character of ordinary bodily action, once you have this distinctive interplay of subpersonal stuff and different kinds of things. And once you see that space open to you, then it becomes attractive. And I think there are new spaces that opening up to developmental kinds of things would allow us to see as well.
No more fingers?
Hey, should we thank her? Well, you're the chair.
Yes, let's thank
Let's get out of here fairly quickly, because we're all quite hungry.